We've also been reminded.
You're listening to the BBC World Service and a special news programme from London. We're listening live to President Barack Obama's speech to members of Parliament in Westminster Hall.
With such market failures. Safeguards to protect the banking system after the Great Depression, for example. Regulations that were established to prevent the pollution of our air and our water during the 1970s. But in today's economy, such threats of market failure can no longer be contained within the borders of any one country. Market failures can go global and go viral and demand international responses. A financial crisis that began on Wall Street infected nearly every continent, which is why we must keep working through forums like the G20 to put in place global rules of the road to prevent future excesses and abuse. No country can hide from the dangers of carbon pollution, which is why we must build on what was achieved at Copenhagen and Cancun to leave our children a planet that is safer and cleaner. Moreover, even when the free market works as it should, both our countries recognize that no matter how responsibly we live in our lives, hard times or bad luck, a crippling illness or a layoff may strike any one of us. And so part of our common tradition has expressed itself in a conviction that every citizen deserves a basic measure of security. Health care if you get sick, unemployment insurance if you lose your job, a dignified retirement after a lifetime of hard work. That commitment to our citizens has also been the reason for our leadership in the world. And now, having come through a terrible recession, our challenge is to meet these obligations while ensuring that we're not consuming and hence consumed with a level of debt that could sap the strength and vitality of our economies. And that will require difficult choices and will require different paths for both of our countries. But we have faced such challenges before and have always been able to balance the need for fiscal responsibility with the responsibilities we have to one another. And I believe we can do this again. As we do, the successes and failures of our own past can serve as an example for emerging economies. That it's possible to grow without polluting. That lasting prosperity comes not from what a nation consumes, but from what it produces and from the investments it makes in its people and its infrastructure. Now, just as we must lead on behalf of the prosperity of our citizens, so we must safeguard their security. Our two nations know what it is to confront evil in the world. Hitler's armies would not have stopped their killing had we not fought them on the beaches and on the landing grounds, in the fields and on the streets. We must never forget that there was nothing inevitable about our victory in that terrible war. It was won through the courage and character of our people. Precisely because we are willing to bear its burden, we know well the cost of war. And that is why we built an alliance that was strong enough to defend this continent while deterring our enemies. At its core, NATO is rooted in the simple concept of Article 5, that no NATO nation will have to fend on its own, that allies will stand by one another, always. And for 6 decades, NATO has been the most successful alliance in human history. Today, we confront a different enemy. Terrorists have taken the lives of our citizens in New York and in London. And while al-Qaeda seeks a religious war with the West, we must remember that they have killed thousands of Muslims, men, women, and children around the globe. Our nations are not and will never be at war with Islam. Our fight is focused on defeating al-Qaeda and its extremist allies. In that effort, we will not relent, as Osama bin Laden and his followers have learned. And as we fight an enemy that respects no law of war, we will continue to hold ourselves to a higher standard by living up to the values, the rule of law, and due process that we so ardently defend. For almost a decade, Afghanistan has been a central front of these efforts. Throughout those years, you, the British people, have been a stalwart ally, along with so many others who fight by our side. Together, let us pay tribute to all of our men and women who have served and sacrificed over the last several years. For they are part of an unbroken line of heroes who have borne the heaviest burden for the freedoms that we enjoy. Because of them, we have broken the Taliban's momentum. Because of them, we have built the capacity of Afghan security forces. And because of them, we are now preparing to turn a corner in Afghanistan by transitioning to Afghan lead. And during this transition, we will pursue a lasting peace with those who break free of al-Qaeda and respect the Afghan constitution and lay down arms. And we will ensure that Afghanistan is never a safe haven for terror, but is instead a country that is strong, sovereign, and able to stand on its own 2 feet. Indeed, our efforts in this young century have led us to a new concept for NATO that will give us the capabilities needed to meet new threats. Threats like terrorism and piracy, cyber attacks and ballistic missiles. But a revitalized NATO will continue to hew to that original vision of its founders, allowing us to rally collective action for the defense of our people, while building upon the broader belief of Roosevelt and Churchill that all nations have both rights and responsibilities, and all nations share a common interest in an international architecture that maintains the peace. We also share a common interest in stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. Across the globe, nations are locking down nuclear materials so they never fall into the wrong hands because of our leadership. From North Korea to Iran, we've sent a message that those who flaunt their obligations will face consequences, which is why America and the European Union just recently strengthened our sanctions on Iran, in large part because of the leadership of the United Kingdom and the United States. And while we hold others to account, we will meet our own obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and strive for a world without nuclear weapons. We share a common interest in resolving conflicts that prolong human suffering and threaten to tear whole regions asunder. In Sudan, after years of war and thousands of deaths, we call on both North and South to pull back from the brink of violence and choose the path of peace. And in the Middle East, we stand united in our support for a secure Israel and a sovereign Palestine. And we share a common interest in development that advances dignity and security. To succeed, we must cast aside the impulse to look at impoverished parts of the globe as a place for charity. Instead, we should empower the same forces that have allowed our own people to thrive. We should help the hungry to feed themselves, the doctors who care for the sick. We should support countries that confront corruption and allow their people to innovate. And we should advance the truth that nations prosper when they allow women and girls to reach their full potential. We do these things because we believe not simply in the rights of nations, we believe in the rights of citizens. That is the beacon that guided us through our fight against fascism and our twilight struggle against communism, and today that idea is being put to the test in the Middle East and North Africa. In country after country, people are mobilizing to free themselves from the grip of an iron fist. And while these movements for change are just 6 months old, we have seen them play out before. from Eastern Europe to the Americas, from South Africa to Southeast Asia. History tells us that democracy is not easy. It will be years before these revolutions reach their conclusion, and there will be difficult days along the way. Power rarely gives up without a fight, particularly in places where there are divisions of tribe and divisions of sect. We also know that populism can take dangerous turns, from the extremism of those who would use democracy to deny minority rights to the nationalism that left so many scars on this continent in the 20th century. But make no mistake, what we saw, what we are seeing in Tehran, in Tunis, in Tahrir Square, is a longing for the same freedoms that we take for granted here at home. It was a rejection of the notion that people in certain parts of the world don't want to be free or need to have democracy imposed upon them. It was a rebuke to the worldview of Al-Qaeda, which smothers the rights of individuals and would thereby subject them to perpetual poverty and violence. Let there be no doubt, the United States and United Kingdom stand squarely on the side of those who long to be free. And now we must show that we will back up those words with deeds. That means investing in the future of those nations that transition to democracy, starting with Tunisia and Egypt, by deepening ties of trade and commerce, by helping them demonstrate that freedom brings prosperity. And that means standing up for universal rights, by sanctioning those who pursue repression, strengthening civil society, supporting the rights of minorities. We do this knowing that the West must overcome suspicion and mistrust among many in the Middle East and North Africa, a mistrust that is rooted in a difficult past. For years, we've faced charges of hypocrisy from those who do not enjoy the freedoms that they hear us espouse. And so to them, we must squarely acknowledge that, yes, we have enduring interests in the region to fight terror, sometimes with partners who may not be perfect, to protect against disruptions of the world's energy supply. But we must also insist that we reject as false the choice between our interests and our ideals, between stability and democracy. For our idealism is rooted in the realities of history, that repression offers only the false promise of stability, that societies are more successful when their citizens are free, and that democracies are the closest allies we have. It is that truth that guides our action in Libya. It would have been easy, at the outset of the crackdown in Libya, to say that none of this was our business, that a nation's sovereignty is more important than the slaughter of civilians within its borders. That argument carries weight with some. But we are different. We embrace a broader responsibility. And while we cannot stop every injustice, there are circumstances that cut through our caution. When a leader is threatening to massacre his people, and the international community is calling for action. That's why we stopped a massacre in Libya. And we will not relent until the people of Libya are protected and the shadow of tyranny is lifted. We will proceed with humility and the knowledge that we cannot dictate every outcome abroad. Ultimately, freedom must be won by the people themselves, not imposed from without. But we can and must stand with those who so struggle, because we have always believed that the future of our children and grandchildren will be better if other people's children and grandchildren are more prosperous and more free. From the beaches of Normandy to the Balkans to Benghazi. That is our interests and our ideals. And if we fail to meet that responsibility, who would take our place? And what kind of world would we pass on? Our action, our leadership, is essential to the cause of human dignity. And so we must act and lead with confidence in our ideals and an abiding faith in the character of our people who sent us all here today. For there is one final quality that I believe makes the United States and the United Kingdom indispensable to this moment in history. And that is how we define ourselves as nations. Unlike most countries in the world, we do not define citizenship based on race or ethnicity. Being American or British is not about belonging to a certain group. It's about believing in a certain set of ideals. The rights of individuals, the rule of law. That is why we hold incredible diversity within our borders. That's why there are people around the world right now who believe that if they come to America, if they come to New York, if they come to London, if they work hard, they can pledge allegiance to our flag and call themselves Americans. If they come to England, they can make a new life for themselves and can sing God Save the Queen just like any other citizen. Yes, our diversity can lead to tension. And throughout our history, there have been heated debates about immigration and assimilation in both of our countries. But even as these debates can be difficult, we fundamentally recognize that our patchwork heritage is an enormous strength. That in a world which will only grow smaller and more interconnected, the example of our two nations says it is possible for people to be united by their ideals instead of divided by their differences. It is possible for hearts to change and old hatreds to pass. That it's possible for the sons and daughters of former colonies to sit here as members of this great parliament, and for the grandson of a Kenyan who served as a cook in the British Army to stand before you as President of the United States. That is what defines us. That is why the young men and women in the streets of Damascus and Cairo still reach for the rights our citizens enjoy, even if they sometimes differ with our policies. As two of the most powerful nations in the history of the world, we must always remember that the true source of our influence hasn't just been the size of our economies, or the reach of our militaries, or the land that we've claimed. It has been the values that we must never waver in defending around the world. The idea that all beings are endowed by our Creator with certain rights that cannot be denied. That is what forged our bond in the fire of war. A bond made manifest by the friendship between two of our greatest leaders. Churchill and Roosevelt had their differences. They were keen observers of each other's blind spots and shortcomings, if not always their own. And they were hard-headed about their ability to remake the world. But what joined the fates of these two men at that particular moment in history was not simply a shared interest in victory on the battlefield. It was a shared belief in the ultimate triumph of human freedom and human dignity. A conviction that we have a say in how this story ends. This conviction lives on in their people today. The challenges we face are great. The work before us is hard. But we have come through a difficult decade, and whenever the tests and trials ahead may seem too big or too many, let us turn to their example and the words that Churchill spoke on the day that Europe was freed. In the long years to come, not only will the people of this island, but the world, wherever the bird of freedom chirps in the human heart, look back to what we've done, and they will say, do not despair, do not yield, march straight forward. With courage and purpose, with humility and with hope, with faith in the promise of tomorrow, let us march straight forward, together, enduring allies, in the cause of a world that is more peaceful, more prosperous, and more just. Thank you very much.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Claire Balderson outside Buckingham Palace with special coverage of President Obama's speech to the British Parliament. We've changed our schedules to bring you the speech, the climax of the American leader's state visit to the UK, and we'll be with you through to 17 hours BST. Well, President Obama is now being applauded by his audience in Westminster Hall in the Houses of Parliament, and he has just delivered a speech lasting 45 minutes or so in front of members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords, members of the House of Commons, religious leaders as well, former Prime Ministers sitting alongside the current Prime Minister David Cameron. They are applauding him. He's acknowledging their applause in that very grand setting that we have there. Hundreds of people listening to the President's speech on this state visit to the UK. That's the speech that people have been waiting for. In this special news programme, we'll be talking about what he said and what it means for the relationship with the UK, not just the UK, but other countries as well. He began the speech with a little bit of a joke, and then some of the history of the venue that he was in, some of the history of the relationship between Britain and the United States. He talked of the common cause, the places they'd fought together from the Second World War to Iraq, Afghanistan. He talked also of the rise of China and other nations around the world and the questions that had led to. Would it mean the power of America and other powers like Britain, would it mean their powers waning? The answers seem to be no. He was saying that there were lessons to be learned from the West, that the US and Britain could set examples, and he talked about those examples, and he talked a lot about their shared values and how those could be shared further around the world. The Middle East, in particular, featured in his speech there in Westminster Hall. Well, I'm joined in our small open-sided tent on the edge of the Mall by Bruce Orwell, Wall Street Journal bureau chief here in London. Catherine Mayer is also with us. She's American-born, but a long-time resident of London, a citizen in London, I do believe, and most recently the author of a book, Amortality, it's called, The Pleasures and Perils of Living Agelessly. Catherine, this was a very wide-ranging speech. Was it the Obama doctrine?
It was, I think, but when you say doctrine, I'm curiously unnourished by that speech. It was absolutely vintage Obama in the rhetoric, in the delivery. There were all sorts of big ideas in there, but I kept being aware of the gap between reality and rhetoric in that speech, in a way that quite often he's more able to sort of sweep you away than happened this time. And I was just trying to analyse why that was, but I think it's because one of the most important things he needed to do in that speech was to talk about how it would be possible to harness the Arab Spring and turn it into something meaningful. And he tried to deal with the fact that, for example, in his earlier speeches, he hasn't mentioned Saudi Arabia, he hasn't mentioned Bahrain, he hasn't mentioned the problematic of dealing with these very difficult allies. This time he mentioned it, but he tried to sort of say that there wasn't a contradiction there. But I don't really think he dealt with that. I don't know what you felt about that.
Bruce, did you feel there was a gap between reality and rhetoric?
Well, I think what he's trying to do is to put everything in a much broader historical context here. You know, he's painting on a big canvas and, you know, saying, you know, with a message of the UK and the US and Europe to some broader degree having shared ownership of the development of ideas like democracy and capitalism and things like that, human rights. And now it's our responsibility shared to help make sure that those tools are implemented in the rest of the world. So he goes back and paints a very big picture, going back to, you know, connecting the dots from Adam Smith and Darwin to Steve Jobs, and you know, trying to show how those people and their innovations and their tools made America and the UK great, and now they are making the developing world great. Those very tools are turning into our competition. We've, you know, created our own competition in a sense. Going forward, he's trying to say those same tools now must be put in the hands of these other nations at a crucial time in history. And so I think he's just trying to use this big moment in this big hall fraught with significance, you know, to make a much broader point.
Yeah, and I wonder, bring in here Rob Watson, our political correspondent who's in Westminster. And Rob, I wonder if it was in some ways a bit of a pep talk for the Europeans, for Britain, for the United States as well, sort of saying we're not finished yet, we've got an awful lot we can share with the world.
Absolutely. In its fundamentals, it strikes me, and I think Bruce and Catherine have alluded to this, it was a defence of the West, wasn't it? A defence of its history, a defence of its values, but also a defence of its relevance. And there was that passage in the speech, wasn't there, when he talked about the rise of developing countries as a good thing, of emerging nations such as India and China, but going on to say that none of that meant that the West, that the United States, the transatlantic alliance, bringing in Britain, the rest of Europe, was somehow going to be sidelined, or that it no longer had a leadership role because of these core values, the values that Bruce has talked about, its role in generating capitalism, the West's role in promoting education and democracy. So I think really, in broad terms, it was that a defence of the West, and yet somehow it didn't quite grab as some of his other speeches have. Maybe that's just because it was of such a grand speech, and perhaps because there were some rather awkward corners to turn in it.
And did you feel, Rob, that this would go down well with the audience there? Of course, it's an audience from all parties across the political spectrum. That this was the kind of thing they were expecting to hear.
Absolutely. No, I don't think there's any doubt it would go down well. And let's remember, this wasn't, I don't think, just directed at the people sitting there or to an American audience, but of course to a European and global audience. And specifically when it comes to that British and European audience, this idea that the transatlantic alliance is still important, that the West remains important, that its values remain important, that we're not somehow on the way out, that we're not in decline, I think is a kind of pep talk that people would like. Now, whether they, when they reflect soberly on it, whether they buy into it, whether they think it's true, or whether they think that maybe the world is shifting in its tilt towards the East is quite another matter, of course.
Okay, Rob, for now, thanks very much indeed. We're just looking now at President Obama, who is shaking many, many hands in Westminster Hall, where the people have just heard his speech. They're still applauding him, the audience there. It's been going on for a few minutes now. He's certainly been very well received, but of course that is partly because it's quite rare to have such a visit, to have an American president making a big speech like this in such a formal setting, to have anyone doing it. As I've been saying, only 3 people from abroad, 3 foreign leaders have done the same thing in the past. So quite an occasion there for all concerned, and the President shaking hands and thanking people before he leaves and goes off to private meetings later on. We'll talk a bit more about the speech, get some reaction. We hope to catch up with some of the people who have been in the hall listening to that a little later on in the programme. But let's get the main world news now from James Kumarasamy.
Thanks, Claire. Well, these are the main headlines at this hour. As we've been hearing, President Obama, addressing both houses of Parliament here in London, has said that the leadership of the United States, the United Kingdom and their allies remains essential, and that they are the greatest catalyst for global action. Fighting in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, is intensifying as the country's most powerful tribal group clashes with government forces. The governing body of world football, FIFA, is investigating more corruption allegations, this time involving the election of its president, which is just days away. And ending days of speculation, the French finance minister Christine Lagarde has put herself forward to be the next head of the International Monetary Fund. Well, at a news conference in Paris, she said that her experience as a lawyer, business leader and cabinet minister would all be important to the job, but she also spoke of her experience as a woman. And the BBC's Europe editor Gavin Hewitt has been speaking to Christine Lagarde. First, what does she mean when she said that she would bring her experience as a woman to the job of IMF head?
In terms of being a woman, I think, I bring to the equation a new dimension that is not very often represented in financial circles. And I'm not suggesting that I should discriminate against anyone, but I think to include, to reach out to all is actually a plus, particularly suited for the institution.
Why should a European once again get this job? After all, the emerging economies are making a bigger and bigger impact economically. Why shouldn't somebody from one of those countries run the IMF?
Well, it's not my turn or your turn. It's a question of an open and transparent process that is merit-based. My colleague and friend, Agustin Carstens from Mexico, is running as well. I'm running. There might be other candidates coming out in the next few days. And that's exactly what it should be. Open, transparent process, merit-based, and it's for the board to actually decide.
You have been at the heart of managing the bailouts in the Eurozone, and yet a year after that started, there isn't really success. Isn't that a problem for you, that you haven't been able so far to end this crisis in the Eurozone?
We might not have ended it, but at least we've stopped it. We've stopped it from a very, very serious chaos that would have resulted had we not, for instance, set up the European Financial Stability Fund and literally bailed out Greece at a time when it was difficult. And then later on Ireland, because of the stretching out of the banking sector in Ireland. Also because we significantly strengthened the economic governance of the Eurozone. This is work in progress. It's not going to be turned around in a matter of a couple of weeks or a couple of months. It's an enduring task, and it's a path that I hope those countries that are under support at the moment will continue to deliver on in terms of both fiscal consolidation as well as structural reforms.
And if you were to be successful, what do you see currently as the priority for Europe as it continues to deal with its mountains of debt?
Well, the priority is to deliver on promises that were made. Fiscal consolidation, as I said, is a must. Strong, courageous structural reforms is another must. And it's just a pattern that has to be endorsed, accepted, and it's the only way we shall actually improve the competitiveness of Europe. We have a program that is called Europe 2020. We've got to really adjust to that. It's a matter of competitiveness, it's a matter of investing in innovation, it's a matter of training our workforce. We have considerable assets in Europe, but with better leverage on them.
French finance minister and candidate for the next head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, speaking to our Europe editor, Gavin Hewitt.
Well, welcome back to Buckingham Palace. I'm just outside Buckingham Palace. This is Claire Balderson with a BBC News special covering President Obama's speech in Parliament this afternoon here in London. He's just delivered that speech, a very wide-ranging speech talking about the leadership of Britain and the United States, the relationship between the two countries, the strength of it, the importance of it as an example to the rest of the world, the values that the two countries share and how they can spread those values around the world as well. It was well received by an invited audience sitting there, members of the House of Commons, members of the House of Lords, some invited guests from all sorts of walks of life, lots of religious leaders and others. Former Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were in the audience, as was Sir John Major. Obviously a very significant occasion here on Barack Obama's state visit to the UK. And in our little studios outside Buckingham Palace, I have Bruce Orwell of the Wall Street Journal and and also Catherine Mayer of Time magazine. And there was a lot in this speech, really, that was aimed at the Middle East and what's been happening there, wasn't there? Was that, Bruce, a message for the people in the Middle East when he talked about overcoming suspicion and mistrust of the West, for example?
Well, there is, and he's also, he tried to paint a picture of the complexity of all of this, as you point out, trying to get them to trust the West, trying to point out that our partners in executing this mission there are sometimes going to be imperfect, as the West has learned, frequently, and also underscoring to everybody, which I think is, a big part of his message today overall, is that this is going to be a long process. The Arab Spring is not going to literally end when the spring ends here. This could be another long episode. He said it will be years before these efforts reach their conclusion, and power does not give up easily. And I think that's a big thing that he's trying to emphasize here, as there have been efforts to try to, by some nations, to say, come on, let's hurry up, let's put more into Libya and get it over with. I think he's saying this, you really take, it's a high altitude view, and you have to take the long view.
The biggest sort of big idea in there, the most concrete of them, was about taking this forward actually to the G8 and talking about investment in the countries that are doing what he described as embracing democracy. It actually somewhat remains to be seen what is going to happen in Egypt, but he's talking about Egypt and Tunisia and about putting our money where our mouths are, and that is in fact what both he and Cameron have done is that they've signalled very loudly that they are coming to the G8 with this as a plan. There's talk of extending the remit of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development so that it can actually move in there. So there is. I was feeling unnourished by the lack of substance, but I'm grasping at some of the bits where there is some substance.
You felt that
there
was some substance.
Well, it's potential. I mean, there is an actual plan that's being alluded to there.
And modelling itself a little bit on what happened after the Second World War, but this time Britain and America doing it together, providing funds or egging others on to provide funds.
But also omitting, in terms of economic development, kind of forgetting to remember how much of economic development money has been pumped into Iraq and Afghanistan that has been totally unproductive and has done really almost nothing to build capitalism in those areas. So it's a very, very complicated picture and a long, tough road, and I think he's trying to highlight what can be done without sort of calling attention to some of the challenges there.
Still with us in our studios in Westminster is our political correspondent Rob Watson. And Rob, a lot of this was about Britain and the United States sort of being joined at the hip when it comes to military action, references to Afghanistan, to Iraq. Thank you from the President to all the people who served in those countries, but then also, of course, talking about Libya, what's happening there, and the NATO-led action. Is that something that there's big differences on amongst the politicians who were in that hall? Would there have been people perhaps there tutting under their breath?
Well, there are certainly some people in the hall who would be rather sceptical of the action, in particular in Libya. There's no doubt that while the government here has got broad support in the Commons in terms of votes for the action in Libya, there were an awful lot of people who think, well, should we really be getting involved there? Are we going to make things worse? Are we going to make things better? But I suspect that, going back to what Bruce and Catherine have been saying, they will have been somewhat reassured by that sense from President Obama that, look, no one is saying that this is going to be straightforward and easy, and that we're certainly not proposing implementing democracy at the barrel of a gun in the Middle East or other parts of that region. And indeed, I was rather struck by some of the speeches I heard when I was a political correspondent for the BBC in Washington, where quite often President Bush and Condoleezza Rice, then his national security advisor, made these big speeches about Western values, the power of democracy, and how it would be a good thing if other countries adopted it, particularly in the Middle East. But there was this added flavour from President Obama about the need for humility, and that this wasn't something that we would be able to in the West dictate to these countries, but that we could somehow help or support in certain ways. In other words, a rather kind of nuanced picture.
I wonder, Bruce, how that notion of humility, almost a sort of apology for some past actions and for how the West is viewed in the Middle East, how that'll go down back at home.
Well, the president also made reference, earlier in his address to some of the problems that our own countries have had, in their history. He referenced very clearly slavery in the United States, immigration problems elsewhere. I mean, you're not painting a picture of a perfect world before or now, and so I think the American people have a clear view of the flaws that we ourselves have been through as a country and the difficult path ahead.
You're listening to a special news program from the BBC World Service, where we've been covering President Obama's speech in Parliament during his state visit to the United Kingdom. We're broadcasting from a special studio just outside Buckingham Palace, and we hope to have more coverage from inside Parliament, where the guests are just leaving, to talk to some of the people who were inside very shortly. But let's just get some of the rest of the main news today from James Kimarasamy.
Claire, thanks very much. Yes, thousands of Yemenis are trying to flee the capital Sana'a after a third day of clashes between security forces and the country's most powerful tribal federation. More than 40 people have died in the fighting, which broke out on Monday after security forces moved against the compound of the tribal leader, Sheikh Sadiq al-Ahmar. Government forces are now trying to impose tight security to stop the Sheikh's tribal supporters from entering the capital. But who is the Sheikh? It's a question I put to Mohammed Kubati, a former advisor to the Yemeni Prime Minister, who's now an opposition activist. He defected from Yemen earlier in the year when the protests began.
Sheikh Sadiq al-Ahmar, he is the son of the late Abdullah al-Ahmar, who was the paramount Sheikh of the Hashid Confederation, which is the most powerful confederation of tribes. Not the biggest, but the most powerful one. And Sheikh Abdullah al-Ahmar, who is the father of Sadiq, who died 4 years ago, was a very important figure in the history of Yemen over the past 50 years. He was really, you could say, the kingmaker who has brought all the presidents who came from 1962 after the fall of the monarchy in Yemen.
President Saleh has accused the Sheikh of trying to provoke civil war. Does he have the power to do that? Does his tribe have the power to do that? I
think President Ali Abdullah Saleh, all the time, he has his tactics. He's tried to portray, the recent uprising against the regime as a confrontation at one stage between him and the formal opposition, and that's why the GCC initiative, I think, faltered. And now he's trying to portray the uprising again as if it's a confrontation between two families: his family, his own family, and the family of Sheikh Abdullah al-Ahmar, who are a powerful family. But that's not the actual problem of Yemen now. I think the whole regime is facing an uprising from all parts of the society across Yemen, from north, south, east, everywhere.
Can he cling on to power? We heard President Obama telling him, he should accept the need to hand over power. In this defiant statement from his spokesperson, he has again said, we are not listening to outside voices, essentially. Can he hold on?
I think, as a matter of holding on, he can't. With the uprising, it's all over the country. Most of the governorates are outside his control and so on. It's just the problem is he's going to push the country more and more. We're on the verge of full-scale civil war. And if he manages to do that, then the whole country will just part into a state of disintegration, which I think has been his sort of exit plan. He thinks that his only guarantee is to leave the country totally disintegrated, and then he disappears with the funds he has embezzled, and where he cannot be, prosecuted or followed for prosecution by any eligible authority in the country.
Now that what is happening in Yemen seems to have gone to a new level of violence, increasing numbers of deaths over the last few days, what could or should the outside world do?
I think we have been asking the outside world, especially our friends in the West, the United States, UK, Europeans and so on. I think they have got to start moving instead of just speaking. We would like to see President Obama's words move into actions. I mean, it would be quite important to see that his assets are being frozen. There is some travel ban on him. There is sanctions, and then weapons should not be allowed to be imported into the country. And I think the most important is the file of atrocities against humanity should be moved to the United Nations, and the United Nations Human Rights Council.
And that was Mohammed Kubati, a former advisor to the Yemeni Prime Minister, now an opposition activist.
Welcome back to our studios at Canada Gate, just outside Buckingham Palace, where the tourists have been gathering to catch a glimpse of President Barack Obama. He's been staying at the palace, a guest of the Queen, and a little earlier today he headed off to Parliament for that major speech. A rare honour to give such a speech in Parliament to members of Parliament and invited guests, and amongst them Yasmin Ali Khan. She's a teacher at Kingsmead Comprehensive School in North London. She spent a year teaching in Santa Barbara, California, as part of the Fulbright Exchange Program, and she was one of a handful of Fulbright alumni invited to today's speech. She joins us on the line. What was it like, Yasmin? Must have been extraordinary for you.
It was just amazing, just seeing someone like that in the flesh. It was just incredible, really. There was a real build-up to it, and all the MPs and members of Parliament there, and then when he came out, there was just awe. It was just amazing.
And what did you think of the speech itself?
Okay, it was amazing. I mean, it was quite somber at times. I think he had serious issues to say, but he got them across really well, always kind of going on about the importance of the British and American relationship, and I mean, it was just so well delivered. It was incredible.
And as someone who has taught in London and has also spent time in Santa Barbara, California, working there, do you believe in this special relationship, or do you think it's a bit of a myth?
Well, I was so welcomed. I mean, I just think they love the British accent, and when I was over there, I did feel like I was at home. I mean, I did get a warm welcome, and I've been, so I mean, I think I really believe in it.
And you are right now, I believe, still in Westminster Hall. You sound like you're possibly trying to walk out of it at the moment.
Yeah, he's just left, and we're just going to, we've been invited by the embassy for a special reception by the Speaker of the House of Commons, so I'm just heading there now.
And what was it like? Just give me a brief description of what's going on. Lots of people milling around, I expect.
Oh, there are crowds outside just trying to kind of get a sneaky peep. I mean, it's been interesting. There's been Tom Hanks with the few rows, you know, he was talking to Nick Clegg, just looking around and seeing all these such famous faces.
Quite overwhelming. What are you going to tell the kids when you get back to Kingsmead School?
Oh, I'm going to be gushing. They're going to get it all day tomorrow. So, it's just been a really awesome day.
All right, Yasmin, enjoy the reception that you're off to. We'll let you go to that. But also in the audience were some British students who were specially invited to hear President Obama. Priscilla Mensah is one of them, 17 years old, from Burntwood Comprehensive School in South London. I believe she's on the line as well. Priscilla, what was it like?
Oh, hi. It was overwhelming, really, just to hear him speak and be so close to someone who I look up to and respect his work. So it was the most overwhelming thing I've ever done.
Well, why were you invited? How come you were there?
Well, I represented Burntwood School in 2010 for the Benjamin Franklin Transatlantic Fellowship Program, which is a debate tournament run by the US Embassy, and I won last year, 2010, which I received a month-long summer school in America, and I got to go to the State Department, visit Washington, etc. So that's the reason why the US Embassy invited me today, and Emily, who won this year.
I'm just going to pause there, Priscilla, because I think President Obama is coming back to where we are now. We get that little ripple of excitement that goes round the crowd here outside Buckingham Palace. The convoy is just heading back now. In fact, his car is driving past us right now, an American flag and a British flag on the front of it. It's very hard to see the President. You hear a few cheers from people, but he's behind bulletproof and tinted glass. Priscilla, I think you got a much better view of the President and, of course, had to listen to what he said. Did you like what he said?
Yes, I think everything he said was, everything. It talked a lot about the relationship and establishing and re-establishing the relationship that that England and the US, of course, already have. So it was, I think everything he said was exactly what was right and true. So.
Did you find it inspiring?
Oh, most definitely. He talks about the future and teenagers and young people such as myself who will hopefully one day be able to do the same sort of work that he does. So.
Okay, and just describe for us where you are now, what's going on. Still lots of people around?
Yes, lots of people are milling out, so we're just standing in a corner here trying to hear on the radio show. So, yes, there's a lot of people, a lot of excitement still. So.
Okay. Priscilla, thanks very much. Priscilla Mensah there, a student who was in the audience for President Obama's speech. And she mentioned that the President referred to young people. That's something that Michelle Obama, the First Lady, has been talking about a lot on this trip and on a previous trip to the UK. And today she's been at Oxford University, and she's taken some schoolgirls there from a North London school who she met when she was here last time in 2009. And she spoke there of her own experience making it from a poor background to a top university. She had these words of advice for the girls.
I remember back when I was your age, trying to decide which schools that I would apply to, and I remember how well-meaning but misguided people sometimes question whether someone with my background could succeed at an elite university. And when I was accepted at one of those universities, I had all kinds of worries and fears and doubts before I entered. I worried that I wouldn't be as well prepared as students who had come from more privileged families. I worried that I wouldn't fit in somewhere so different from where I'd grown up, or with people whose backgrounds were so different from mine. But after a few months in college, away from home on my own, I realized that I was just as capable and I had just as much to offer any of my classmates. I realized that if I worked hard enough, I could do just as well as anyone else. I realized that success is not about the background you're from. It's about the confidence that you have and the effort you're willing to invest.
That was Michelle Obama speaking in Oxford to some students that she'd taken there, some students that she met a couple of years ago when she was visiting London, and she's been talking to them again today. Still with me here for our BBC News special outside Buckingham Palace, Catherine Mayer of Time magazine. And Catherine, Michelle Obama's always a hit when she comes to Britain, isn't she?
Yes, I mean, she is such a warm, engaging, natural presence that, you know, people respond incredibly well to her. The thing, I always am slightly worried by the whole sort of First Lady thing, because I really want to in my lifetime, see not just one woman president, but rather a lot of them. So, you know, on the one hand, I regret that she's coming here in the helpmeet role, but she does it extremely well.
And she does her own thing, doesn't she? She's made this kind of inspiring young people, mentoring. She's made that her thing.
And also trying to get Americans to live a bit healthier, which, believe you me, is an important thing to do.
Bruce, she's an important part of this trip.
Well, she didn't touch the Queen this time, right? So,
Yeah, but that was good when she did. I mean, again, that was kind of spontaneity. In these sort of weird, stilted roles, when people are a bit spontaneous, you do love
I
them,
agree. I think that's actually part of what makes her a powerful presence, is that, you know, and what makes the Obamas a powerful presence is that they can come in and kind of break some molds and get away with it in ways that other people couldn't. And they are both extremely good at, you know, sort of projecting the confidence and the power of the roles that they play. And the First Lady's role, by the way, these days is not what it once was. It's, you know, it is expected that you step into it in a more serious way.
Let's go away from the politics and the diplomacy for a minute, because I want to take you to a man who's been doing his bit for the special or the essential relationship, as they're now calling it. Benoit Provost from France. He's the head barman at the Stafford Hotel's American Bar, which is just around the corner from Buckingham Palace, where we're broadcasting from today. Now, that's a very popular venue for Americans visiting London, and it has been for 60 years. And I went to meet Ben, as he's known, at his post behind the bar.
I've been here at the Stafford for 18 years now. Originally came from France for a year to improve my English, and never left, basically. Just fell in love with the place, and I am 18 years later.
This is the American Bar at the Stafford. There are several other American bars in London, not nearly as many as there used to be. What is the history of the notion of the American bar?
Well, we're going back to the 1930s, basically, with all the cruise liners starting coming this side of the Atlantic, and all the fine establishment at the time basically were trying to capitalize on the American market. So they were trying to attract all the Americans to their places, basically. So they all started renaming their American bar. And at the same time, this is where the cocktail era starting to arrive in UK. Because with them, all the patrons starting bringing the Manhattan, the martinis, Rob Roy's, what we call older classics now. This is when it's already starting to come this side of the Atlantic.
Do you still mix that kind of drink here?
We certainly do, and I mean, there's a great demand, and having mainly American guests staying with us, this is something they're very, very keen on sampling.
You have a lot of American guests staying here, and yet it has a very English feel to it, this place. What do you think it is that attracts them now?
During World War II, the Stafford was used by American and Canadian officers as well as the Free French. I think that was really the starting point of why we do have so many Americans staying with us.
Is it still military people who come?
Not anymore, but on some of them we're on the third generation staying with us.
One of the things we do have to tell our listeners is that the walls of this bar are covered in the most amazing photographs and memorabilia. I mean, literally covered. And looking up at the ceiling, there are flags and banners and ties. I can see men's neckties hanging from the ceilings. It is decorated from top to toe. Tell me a little bit about why this stuff is here and where it came from.
We do have about, over 3,000 items altogether.
And lots of signed photographs. I can see, I think that's Clint Eastwood, a signed photograph. He must have stayed here. And then I think your favourite there, the late Paul Newman.
Yes, that was one of my life when I arrived. I was 23, and to be standing in front of Paul Newman, me reminding all the movies I saw from him was like a legend in front of me. What's one of the highlights, and we're lucky enough. I mean, I was lucky enough to see him on a few occasions because he used to love and stay with us. Because it's feeling like he was like at home basically, and with no one bothering him, he just could walk in the corridor, have his drink in the bar, go to his room, and that's what he really enjoyed.
That was Benoit Provost at the Stafford Hotel on his memory of some famous Americans in London. Let's talk now to Mike Gapes, Labour MP and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the House of Commons, and listening to that speech by Barack Obama that we've just been hearing about. Mike Gapes, what was your reaction?
Well, I was in Parliament and heard Nelson Mandela do the same kind of address to both Houses of Parliament from Westminster Hall a decade ago. I have to say this was very impressive too, and it's one of those historic great occasions for our Parliament.
Did you feel though more than a historic occasion?
No,
is it just about that sort of symbolism, or was there some substance here that you wanted to hear?
There was real substance about democracy. He referred specifically to Damascus as well as Cairo. He talked about the universal values of human rights, which we in the United Kingdom and the United States had been fighting for internationally. He was very, very clear. He talked about the enduring friendship between the peoples of the two countries. He made some nice little jokes about history, and I have to say he was incredibly well received. And at the end, members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords and the Commons and other people there were queuing up to try and shake his hand as he left. It took him about 20 minutes to get out of the hall.
And it probably took you just about as long to get to us, Julius.
I ran away. I didn't have a chance to shake his hand, unfortunately, but I ran through the back way to get to your studio in time to do this.
We're very grateful to you, Mike Gapes, Labour MP and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the House of Commons. Catherine Mayer, we've got about a minute and a half left of this special programme that we're broadcasting from outside Buckingham Palace. Sum up for me, if you would, the visit so far. In fact, the visit is now at an end. The speech, all the pomp and ceremony, everything else. I think we could probably call it, for both the British and the Americans, quite a success.
I'd say a resounding success. In the terms of these visits, you know, there is a limit to anything you can achieve. You're not doing huge deals here. You've got the groundwork prepared before anybody ever gets here. So they've done the business, and I would say I think it's even more of a success for Cameron probably than Obama, but a success.
Bruce, do you agree with that?
I think these guys are both very skilled players on the stages that they occupy, and it was a very well conceived and thought out 2 days, and it went down pretty much by the playbook that they laid out. And as a bonus, I think the British press set a new record for references to this special relationship this time. So it's thumbs up all the way around.
And you've just helped.
Maybe
I'm not British.
Maybe it is truly special, as people have been saying over the last 2 days, or essential, as they're now calling it. Catherine Mayer of Time, Bruce Orwell of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you both for being my guests here in our special studio outside Buckingham Palace as we've been bringing you this programme. My thanks also to our listeners all over the world for joining us for our coverage coverage of President Obama's historic speech there in Westminster Hall. You've been listening to a special programme. I'm Claire Balderson, and this is the BBC World Service.